At the close of the First World War, Finland emerged as an independent state after centuries under Swedish and Russian rule. Declaring independence in December 1917 amid the collapse of the Russian Empire, Finland quickly found itself entangled in geopolitical tensions. The young republic was shaped by the Finnish Civil War of early 1918, fought between the Red Guards, backed by Bolshevik Russia, and the White Guards, supported by German troops. The Whites' victory set Finland firmly on a conservative, anti-communist path, but it also left scars in society and marked the Soviet Union as a long-term adversary. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Finland's foreign policy was defined by the need to balance between great powers. The Soviet Union, viewing Finland's independence as a temporary deviation from Russian dominion, pressed for security guarantees, including demands for border adjustments. The Finnish leadership, however, resisted Soviet pressure and prioritized neutrality, hoping to secure Western diplomatic recognition and eventual support in case of crisis. Finland joined the League of Nations in 1920, signed the Treaty of Tartu with the Soviet Union in the same year, fixing borders that left Karelia on the Soviet side, and developed a doctrine of independent defense, investing heavily in reservist systems and fortifications along the Karelian Isthmus. The rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s further complicated Finland's position. While Finland had no ideological alignment with Hitler's regime, German economic ties proved crucial. Germany became a significant market for Finnish timber, paper, and metals, while Finland imported coal and industrial goods. At the same time, Britain remained an important trading partner, and Finland sought to maintain access to Western markets. Thus, by the late 1930s, Finland was economically linked to both Germany and the Western Allies, while militarily vulnerable to the Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 fundamentally altered Finland's geopolitical environment. The secret protocols of the pact assigned Finland, along with the Baltic states, to the Soviet sphere of influence. Almost immediately, Moscow began pressuring Helsinki for territorial concessions, demanding a lease of the Hanko Peninsula for a naval base, a shift of the border on the Karelian Isthmus closer to Viipuri, Viborg, and cession of islands in the Gulf of Finland. Finland offered counterproposals but refused outright concessions. Negotiations collapsed, and on 30 November 1939, the Soviet Union launched a full-scale invasion, initiating the Winter War. The Soviet leadership assumed that the Finnish army, consisting of approximately 300,000 reservists with limited armor and artillery, would collapse in weeks. Instead, the conflict lasted 105 days, from November 1939 to March 1940, and revealed the difficulties of modern warfare in Arctic conditions. The Red Army, with more than 450,000 men initially committed, vast artillery, and hundreds of tanks, encountered stubborn resistance along the Mannerheim Line on the Karelian Isthmus and suffered severe losses in battles at Suomussalmi and Rate Road, where Finnish ski troops encircled and destroyed Soviet divisions. By the war's end, Soviet casualties amounted to approximately 126,000 dead and 188,000 wounded, while Finnish losses were around 25,000 dead and 44,000 wounded. The Moscow Peace Treaty of March 1940 ended the Winter War, but left Finland severely weakened. Finland ceded 11% of its territory, including Viipuri and much of Karelia, to the Soviet Union, and 430,000 Finnish civilians were evacuated from the lost regions. The Soviet Union also secured a lease at Hanko, establishing a naval base that gave it a foothold deep into the Gulf of Finland. Finland, while preserving its independence, had been forced into a precarious position, surrounded by Soviet power and cut off from many of its Western supporters, who had been unable or unwilling to intervene militarily. The echoes of the Winter War reverberated throughout the coming years. Finland's leadership drew two main conclusions. First, that the Soviet Union remained an existential threat to Finnish sovereignty. Second, that Finland could not count on Western intervention in a crisis. As Europe descended further into war, These conclusions shaped Helsinki's delicate maneuvers between Germany and the USSR. The geopolitical balance after the Winter War left Finland in a state of enforced neutrality, but one that leaned increasingly toward Germany. The Soviet Union continued to apply pressure, demanding transit rights for troops across Finnish territory and monitoring Finnish politics. Meanwhile, Germany's victories in 1940, including the fall of France and domination of Scandinavia through the occupation of Norway and Denmark, made Berlin the dominant power in Northern Europe. For Finland, survival meant engaging cautiously with Germany while avoiding open provocation of Moscow. This fragile balancing act, born of the Winter War, defined Finland's place in the Second World War. The small republic, scarred by territorial losses and facing the threat of renewed Soviet aggression, would soon find itself drawn into another conflict, one that forced it to navigate between the ambitions of Hitler and Stalin in order to preserve its existence as an independent state. The end of the Winter War did not bring Finland lasting peace, but instead ushered in a period of uncertainty in which survival depended on cautious maneuvering. The Moscow Peace Treaty of March 1940 left Finland both humiliated and deeply insecure. The loss of Karelia, the destruction of infrastructure, and the displacement of more than 400,000 civilians created enormous social and economic strains. The Finnish government, led by President Kyösti Kallio and later Risto Ryti, faced the task of rebuilding national defense and securing the country's diplomatic future. Yet with the Soviet Union pressing its advantage and Germany consolidating power in Northern Europe, options were severely limited. The Soviet Union, despite its costly victory, continued to view Finland as part of its security perimeter. Soviet forces remained stationed at Hanko under the terms of the lease, and Soviet diplomats maintained constant pressure on Helsinki, demanding further guarantees. Soviet intelligence operations inside Finland expanded, aiming to monitor both domestic politics and foreign contacts. The Red Army, though bloodied by the Winter War, had not abandoned the idea of imposing greater control over Finland if necessary. The annexation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the summer of 1940 demonstrated clearly that Moscow could move to absorb neighbors when conditions allowed. Germany's victories in Western Europe and Scandinavia in 1940 altered Finland's calculations. With Denmark and Norway occupied, the Baltic Sea became a German-controlled zone. Sweden, neutral but economically tied to Germany, was unlikely to risk conflict with Berlin. For Finland, this meant that Germany, not the Western Allies, now dominated Northern Europe. The collapse of France and the isolation of Britain reduced the likelihood of Western support in the event of renewed Soviet aggression. These developments compelled Finnish leaders to look increasingly toward Germany as the only potential counterweight to Soviet pressure. The process of rapprochement was gradual. Finland initially declared strict neutrality in the ongoing World War, hoping to avoid entanglement. Yet behind the scenes, Finnish diplomats cultivated contacts with Germany. Economic agreements expanded, with Finland supplying timber, paper, and nickel in exchange for grain, oil, and military equipment. The German occupation of Norway gave Berlin strategic interest in maintaining access to Finland's resources, especially the nickel mines in Petsamo, which were essential for German armament production. Thus, economic dependence grew into the foundation of political cooperation. At the same time, Finland restructured its armed forces. Although the Winter War had revealed the courage and adaptability of Finnish soldiers, it also exposed deficiencies in equipment and supply. The Finnish army reorganized its command structures, improved training, and sought modern weapons from abroad. Germany gradually became the main supplier, providing artillery, small arms, and aircraft. The Finnish leadership recognized that another war with the Soviet Union was possible and that preparation was essential, even if official policy still emphasized neutrality. Public sentiment in Finland reflected both fear and determination. The trauma of the Winter War created deep resentment toward the Soviet Union, especially among the displaced Karelian population, who longed for the return of their homes. Anti-Soviet feeling became a powerful undercurrent in Finnish society, even as the government maintained cautious diplomatic language. Germany's victories gave some Finns hope that a future alignment with Berlin could lead to the recovery of lost territories. Still, there was no enthusiasm for outright alliance with Nazi ideology. Finnish nationalism focused on survival and territorial integrity, not ideological crusades. Key figures emerged during this phase of balancing. President Risto Ryti, pragmatic and cautious, steered Finland toward closer economic and political ties with Germany while avoiding any declaration that might provoke the Soviets. Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, commander-in-chief of the Finnish armed forces, focused on military reorganization and remained wary of overcommitting to either Germany or the West. His prestige, built during the Winter War, gave him considerable influence over defense and foreign policy. The fragile equilibrium of 1940 and early 1941 was shattered by the escalation of the German-Soviet rivalry. As Hitler prepared for war against the Soviet Union, Germany sought military cooperation with Finland. For Helsinki, this presented both a danger and an opportunity. Joining Germany's campaign risked making Finland a target for Soviet retribution, but refusal risked isolation and renewed invasion without allies. The decisions made in the months leading to Operation Barbarossa would define Finland's fate in the Second World War, and the echoes of the Winter War shaped every calculation. Finland's leaders, aware of their country's vulnerability, prepared for a conflict they could not avoid, hoping to navigate between two great powers without losing the independence so bitterly defended in 1939-1940. As the European War expanded in 1941, Finland's strategic choices narrowed sharply. The Soviet Union's annexation of the Baltic states in June 1940 had brought its borders closer, eliminating the buffer that once separated Finland from direct Soviet control. Meanwhile, Germany's dominance over Scandinavia and its preparation for a confrontation with the Soviet Union created a new dynamic in which Finland could no longer rely on neutrality alone. The leadership in Helsinki was forced to define its objectives more clearly, balancing national survival with the potential to recover territories lost in the Winter War. Finland's strategic objectives after 1940 were shaped by three central goals. First, the preservation of sovereignty remained paramount. The Soviet Union's aggressive expansion demonstrated that independence was not guaranteed. Second, the recovery of lost territories, particularly Karelia and Viipuri, was a pressing political and emotional issue. The displacement of more than 400,000 Finns from ceded regions had created immense social pressures, and the desire to return home carried political weight. Third, Finland sought to avoid total dependence on any one great power. Although leaning toward Germany, Finnish leaders hoped to maintain some margin of independence in decision-making. Germany's objectives, by contrast, were far more expansive. Adolf Hitler's preparations for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, required securing the northern flank. Access to Finnish territory offered two advantages: a base from which to launch attacks against Leningrad and Murmansk, and control over the Petsamo nickel mines, essential for the German war industry. For Berlin, Finnish cooperation was both militarily convenient and economically necessary. Yet Germany also recognized Finland's reluctance to appear as a formal ally and allowed Helsinki to maintain the outward appearance of independence so long as cooperation continued. Logistics played a central role in the planning stage. Finland's military, though battle-hardened by the Winter War, still suffered from shortages of heavy weapons, aircraft, and fuel. German support provided a solution. Beginning in late 1940, shipments of arms, including artillery pieces and small arms, reached Finland. By spring 1941, German troop transports were moving through Finnish ports, officially described as transits, but in fact preparing for coordinated operations. Finnish railways were upgraded to accommodate German supply trains, and airfields in northern Finland were expanded to host Luftwaffe squadrons. This infrastructure buildup indicated the growing military integration between the two states. The Soviet Union, for its part, underestimated Finland's potential role in a German invasion. Soviet intelligence focused on German troop concentrations in Poland and Romania, paying less attention to Northern Europe. Moscow continued to pressure Helsinki diplomatically, but did not anticipate that Finland would become a co-belligerent. The Red Army stationed forces along the Karelian Isthmus and in Murmansk Oblast, but its planning prioritized southern sectors of the front. This miscalculation left Soviet positions in the north vulnerable once Germany and Finland began coordinated action. Miscalculations also existed on the Finnish side. While leaders in Helsinki hoped to pursue parallel war objectives, fighting alongside Germany without becoming fully dependent, they underestimated how closely their actions would tie Finland's fate to the Wehrmacht. The expectation that Finland could regain lost territories, secure its borders, and then negotiate a separate peace ignored the likelihood that both Germany and the Soviet Union would resist such a maneuver. Finland's propaganda emphasized defensive aims and the correction of the injustices of 1940, but in practice, the operational planning aligned closely with German strategic goals. Propaganda and public sentiment in Finland reflected these aspirations. Newspapers and radio broadcasts emphasized the injustices of the Moscow Peace Treaty, highlighting the suffering of Karelians who had lost their homes. Anti-Soviet feeling, already widespread after the Winter War, was reinforced by accounts of Soviet oppression in the annexed Baltic states. At the same time, Finnish propaganda avoided direct glorification of Nazi ideology, presenting the coming conflict as a national struggle for survival and restoration, not a crusade. This distinction helped maintain domestic unity, even as Finland entered into increasingly close cooperation with Germany. By May 1941, preparations were nearing completion. German troops, including the Mountain Corps Norway, had been stationed in Lapland, poised to strike toward Murmansk. Finnish forces were mobilized discreetly, with reservists called up under the guise of extraordinary exercises. The mobilization plan aimed to field approximately 500,000 men, a significant number given Finland's population of 3.7 million. The army was reorganized into corps and divisions with a strong emphasis on defense of the Karelian Isthmus and offensive potential in East Karelia. In the weeks before Operation Barbarossa, Finland stood on the brink of another war. The strategic objectives of both Germany and Finland had been aligned through necessity. Germany sought northern security and resources, while Finland sought survival and the recovery of lost lands. Both sides believed they had prepared adequately for the campaign, though each underestimated the complexities that would follow. The stage was set for Finland to become once again a battlefield between two great powers, its fate tied to choices made in the shadow of the Winter War and its unresolved consequences. The opening phase of Finland's re-entry into war began in June 1941, in the shadow of Operation Barbarossa. Although Helsinki had not officially declared war when Germany launched its massive invasion of the Soviet Union on 22 June, the groundwork for Finnish participation had already been laid. German forces were stationed in northern Finland, airfields and bases were in active use, and the Finnish army was mobilizing under the guise of defensive exercises. Within days, the fragile neutrality Finland had attempted to maintain collapsed under the weight of events. The first military actions involving Finnish territory came from the air. On 22 and 23 June, German aircraft operating from Finnish airfields carried out raids against Soviet positions in Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula. In response, the Soviet Air Force launched bombing raids on Finnish cities, including Helsinki, Turku, and Porvoo, on 25 June. Though Soviet sources later claimed these strikes targeted German assets, the fact that Finnish urban centers were bombed provided Helsinki with a political justification to declare that Finland was again at war with the Soviet Union. Thus, what had begun as German-led operations evolved into open hostilities between Finland and the USSR. Command structures were clarified immediately. Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim assumed overall command of Finnish forces, while German units in the north operated under Mountain Corps Norway, commanded by General Edvard Dietl. Finnish and German staffs coordinated closely, though Helsinki maintained formal independence in decision-making. Politically, President Risto Ryti, and Prime Minister Jukka Rangel emphasized that Finland was waging a continuation war aimed at reclaiming territories lost in the Winter War, not an ideological campaign alongside Nazi Germany. Initial movements of Finnish troops reflected both caution and determination. On the Karelian Isthmus, Finnish forces took up positions opposite heavily fortified Soviet lines, avoiding a premature offensive until mobilization was complete. In East Karelia, however, preparations began for deeper advances once operations were underway. In the north, German and Finnish forces prepared to strike toward Murmansk and the vital railway connecting the Arctic port to central Russia. Finnish units also secured Petsamo, ensuring continued access to the strategically important nickel mines. Soviet reactions in the opening phase were defensive but strained. The Red Army had concentrated most of its strength further south to confront the main German advance toward Leningrad, Smolensk, and Kiev. In the Finnish sector, Soviet forces numbered around 200,000, spread thin across Karelia and the Arctic. Soviet commanders attempted to stabilize the front and launched limited attacks into Finnish territory, but these were quickly repelled. The early weeks of fighting revealed Soviet weaknesses in northern logistics and coordination, though they retained considerable numerical strength on the Karelian Isthmus. The Finnish leadership framed the outbreak of hostilities carefully. Official communiques emphasized that Finland had been attacked by the Soviet Union and was now compelled to defend itself. Propaganda invoked the injustices of 1940 and the suffering of displaced Karelians, presenting the war as a necessary act of national restoration. German statements, by contrast, portrayed Finland as an ally of the Reich, though Helsinki avoided using that term publicly. This divergence illustrated Finland's attempt to walk a narrow line, militarily aligned with Germany, yet politically insisting on independent objectives. Civilian reactions in Finland combined fear with determination. Memories of the Winter War were still fresh, and the bombing of cities on 25 June convinced many Finns that the Soviet Union remained committed to their destruction. Mobilization was widely supported, and the return of men to the front was seen as part of an unfinished struggle. At the same time, Finnish society braced for the hardships of prolonged war, aware that the coming months would demand sacrifices. By early July 1941, the opening phase had set the lines clearly. Finland, though formally declaring its independent aims, was engaged in coordinated operations with Germany against the Soviet Union. The Soviets, facing a vast German offensive across the entire front, could not commit their full strength to the Finnish theater. What followed was the transition from defensive positioning and air raids to major ground offensives. The clash that began with cautious moves and retaliatory strikes was now evolving into a broader struggle, in which Finland sought not only to defend its sovereignty, but also to alter the map of Northern Europe once again. The summer of 1941 brought the escalation of Finland's war effort into full-scale operations. What had begun with defensive deployments and retaliatory strikes now evolved into major offensives aimed at reshaping the borders imposed by the Moscow Peace Treaty. For Finland, this was the moment of both greatest opportunity and greatest risk. The army was fully mobilized, numbering around 475,000 men across multiple corps, while German units in Lapland added further strength. Against them, the Red Army deployed approximately 200,000 troops in the Finnish sector, heavily concentrated on the Karelian Isthmus, but thinly spread across northern Karelia and the Arctic. The central objective for Helsinki was the recovery of Karelia and the reclamation of Viipuri, lost in 1940. On 10th July, Finnish forces began advancing on the Karelian Isthmus. The offensive was carefully prepared, with artillery support and infantry moving in coordinated waves. Resistance was heavy. The Soviet 23rd Army defended the isthmus with fortified positions, minefields, and strongpoints. The fighting was costly, but Finnish troops advanced steadily, regaining lost ground. By late August, Viipuri had been recaptured, marking the symbolic reversal of one of the most painful concessions of the Moscow Treaty. Simultaneously, operations unfolded in East Karelia. Finnish forces, including 6 Corps under General Paavo Talvela, crossed into Soviet territory beyond the 1940 borders. Unlike the limited goal of restoring pre-war frontiers, this advance reflected broader aspirations of creating a greater Finland that would unite Finnic peoples. The capture of Petrozavodsk in October demonstrated the scale of this expansion. The Soviets, unprepared for deep Finnish advances in the region, withdrew gradually while inflicting losses through rearguard actions. Civilian populations, primarily Russian and Karelian, were caught in the middle. Some fled eastward with retreating Soviet forces, while others fell under Finnish occupation. In the far north, German and Finnish forces sought to sever the Murmansk Railway and capture the Arctic port of Murmansk. These operations, codenamed Silberfuchs, Silver Fox, began in July. German Mountain Corps Norway, supported by Finnish troops, advanced toward Murmansk from Petsamo and through the Arctic tundra. Yet the terrain and Soviet resistance proved formidable. Harsh conditions, limited infrastructure, and strong Soviet counterattacks halted the advance short of Murmansk. Despite heavy losses on both sides, the railway remained in Soviet hands, ensuring continued Allied aid deliveries through the Arctic convoys. This failure marked one of the first setbacks in the otherwise rapid Axis advances of 1941. The escalation of combat had profound effects on civilian populations. In Karelia, more than 20,000 Soviet civilians were placed in Finnish-administered camps following the capture of Petrozavodsk and surrounding areas. Finnish authorities justified this on security grounds, fearing partisan activity, but conditions in the camps were harsh, with food shortages and disease leading to high mortality. Meanwhile, Finnish civilians who had been evacuated in 1940 began returning to Karelia, reclaiming farms and property. The overlapping displacements underscored the human cost of shifting front lines. Diplomatic tensions also escalated. The Soviet Union condemned Finland's participation in the German invasion, portraying it as proof that Helsinki was an ally of Nazi Germany. Britain, still fighting alone against Germany in Europe, struggled to reconcile its sympathy for Finland's winter war ordeal with its alliance with the USSR after June 1941. By December, Britain declared war on Finland, a move driven by alliance commitments rather than direct hostility. The United States, not yet in the war, maintained cautious distance, refusing to recognize Finland as an enemy, but monitoring closely its deepening ties with Germany. The Finnish leadership faced growing internal debate about the scope of their war aims. President Ryti and sections of the government emphasized the necessity of securing Karelia and pushing the frontier eastward for defensive depth. Marshal Mannerheim, though supportive of recovering lost territories, was more cautious about extensive occupation beyond the 1940 borders. He recognized that advancing too deeply risked drawing Finland into commitments it could not sustain if Germany's campaign against the Soviet Union faltered. Yet the momentum of summer 1941, coupled with German encouragement, carried Finnish forces further into Soviet territory than initially planned. By the end of 1941, escalation had reshaped the map. The Karelian Isthmus was firmly in Finnish hands, East Karelia was occupied, and the front lines extended far beyond the pre-war frontier. Soviet resistance had stiffened, especially around Leningrad, where Finnish forces halted their advance north of the city, maintaining a siege perimeter without directly assaulting the metropolis. In the Arctic, however, the failure to cut Murmansk highlighted the limits of Axis coordination and exposed Finland to prolonged fighting in extreme conditions. This stage of escalation demonstrated both the strength and the vulnerability of Finland's position. The army had achieved major territorial gains, but at the cost of expanding objectives and deepening dependence on Germany. The Soviet Union, though battered, was far from defeated, and the entry of Britain into war against Finland broadened the conflict's dimensions. The months of rapid advance gave way to the realization that Finland's war was no longer simply a continuation of 1939-1940, but a complex struggle enmeshed in the larger clash between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. By the winter of 1941-1942, Finland's war effort had reached its peak intensity. The front lines stretched across Karelia, from the Karelian Isthmus to Lake Onega, and deep into East Karelia, while in the far north, German and Finnish forces remained locked in battle along the Murmansk Railway. The expansion of operations in 1941 had transformed Finland's strategic position, but now the question became whether it could sustain the war effort amid mounting costs and the uncertain progress of Germany's campaign against the Soviet Union. The largest operations of this phase centered on East Karelia. In October 1941, Finnish forces had captured Petrozavodsk, followed by Medvezhegorsk in December. The advance extended Finnish control to the shores of Lake Onega, with front lines stabilizing roughly 100 kilometers east of the 1940 frontier. The occupation of these areas marked the maximum territorial reach of Finnish arms during the Second World War. In total, Finnish forces occupied over 60,000 square kilometers of Soviet territory, extending their defensive depth but also overextending their supply lines. On the Karelian Isthmus, operations reached a natural limit. Finnish forces advanced toward the old 1939 frontier and recaptured Viipuri by August 1941, but they halted north of Leningrad. Although German commanders urged Finnish participation in the direct assault on the city, Marshal Mannerheim refused, citing both humanitarian concerns and the risks of overcommitment. Instead, Finnish units established a defensive line along the old border near the river Svir, effectively blocking Soviet attempts to relieve Leningrad from the north, but avoiding involvement in the siege's heaviest fighting. This decision preserved Finnish forces, but created enduring controversy about Finland's role in the blockade. In the far north, the German-led Operation Silberfuchs had failed to achieve its key objective of capturing Murmansk. Despite advancing from Petsamo toward the Litsa River, German and Finnish units were unable to break through Soviet defenses. The combination of Arctic terrain, strong Soviet reinforcements, and the resilience of the Murmansk Railway ensured the port remained open for Allied convoys. The failure to secure Murmansk had strategic consequences, as it allowed Britain and later the United States to deliver vital supplies to the Soviet Union via the Arctic route. For Finland, the Northern Front tied down divisions in inhospitable terrain without delivering tangible gains. Civilian suffering intensified during this peak period of the conflict. In occupied East Karelia, Finnish authorities established an administration that distinguished between ethnic Finnic populations, such as Karelians and Vepsians, and ethnic Russians. The former were granted limited autonomy and better treatment, while the latter were confined to camps or subjected to strict controls. By 1942, over 20,000 civilians were held in camps under harsh conditions, with mortality rates exacerbated by food shortages and disease. Meanwhile, in Finland proper, the return of Karelian refugees to Viipuri and other recaptured areas was celebrated as a national victory, though reconstruction in war-damaged regions remained slow. For the Finnish military, holding extended lines posed serious logistical challenges. The advance into East Karelia meant supply convoys had to move across poor roads and bridges under constant threat of partisan attacks. Winter conditions worsened the strain, as freezing temperatures and snow hindered movement. Casualties mounted steadily, with over 25,000 Finnish soldiers killed by the end of 1941 and tens of thousands more wounded. Although morale remained relatively high, the realization grew that the war would not end quickly. German and Finnish high commands diverged in their strategic outlook. Berlin pressed Helsinki to commit more fully to the siege of Leningrad and to prepare for further offensives in 1942. Mannerheim, however, resisted, arguing that Finland's objectives had been largely achieved with the recovery of Karelia and the creation of defensible front lines. The Finnish leadership feared that overextension would leave the country vulnerable if Germany failed to achieve a decisive victory in the east. President Riedi, while maintaining political alignment with Germany, shared Mannerheim's caution, emphasizing that Finland's war aims were limited to national security and territorial restitution. On the Soviet side, the winter of 1941-1942 marked a turning point. Having survived the German drive on Moscow, the Red Army began to stabilize its fronts. In the Finnish sector, Soviet forces regrouped and launched limited counterattacks, testing Finnish defenses but failing to achieve breakthroughs. The Soviet leadership viewed Finland as a secondary theater, focusing resources instead on critical battles around Moscow and later Stalingrad. Nonetheless, Stalin remained determined to punish Finland for its alignment with Germany, and preparations for larger offensives in the north continued. Internationally, Finland's position grew more precarious. Britain's declaration of war in December 1941 severed diplomatic ties with London and undermined Finland's efforts to portray itself as a co-belligerent rather than an Axis ally. The United States, entering the war after Pearl Harbor, adopted a cautious stance, refraining from declaring war on Finland, but increasingly pressuring Helsinki through diplomatic channels. This isolation highlighted the risks of Finland's deepening dependence on Germany, even as Finnish leaders continued to assert their independent aims. By the beginning of 1942, Finland had reached the peak of its wartime expansion. The army held a vast front line, stretching from the Arctic tundra to the shores of Lake Onega. The population had endured mobilization, bombing, and displacement, but morale was sustained by the recovery of Karelia and the defense of national sovereignty. Yet beneath the surface, strains were mounting. Supply shortages, partisan warfare, civilian suffering in occupied territories, and diplomatic isolation all hinted at the difficulties that lay ahead. The peak of Finland's campaign revealed both the extent of its achievements and the fragility of its position between the ambitions of Germany and the determination of the Soviet Union. By 1942, the war on the Finnish front entered a phase of endurance in which resistance and adaptation became the defining features of both military and civilian life. The rapid advances of 1941 had ceased, and Finland now faced the challenge of holding long defensive lines, maintaining supply networks, and managing occupied territories. At the same time, the Soviet Union adjusted its strategy, preparing to contest Finnish gains not through immediate large-scale offensives, but through attrition, partisans, and political pressure. On the battlefield, Finland reorganized its forces for static defense. The long front, stretching more than 200 kilometers from the Arctic to Lake Ladoga, could not be held by continuous fortifications, so Finnish doctrine relied on strong points, mobile reserves, and extensive use of terrain. Forests, lakes, and marshes were integrated into defensive planning, creating natural barriers. Finnish soldiers built bunkers and trenches along key axes, but most positions emphasized concealment and mobility rather than massive fortifications. This adaptation reflected lessons from the Winter War, where Finnish forces had successfully used flexible tactics against numerically superior enemies. Partisan warfare became one of the most pressing challenges. In East Karelia, Soviet partisan units, often composed of local recruits and NKVD detachments, launched raids against Finnish supply lines, depots, and isolated garrisons. By late 1942, several thousand partisans were active, operating from bases deep in the forests. These attacks disrupted communications, destroyed food stocks, and forced Finland to allocate entire battalions to rear area security. The Finnish army adapted by creating specialized mopping-up units trained in forest warfare to counter partisans. Despite these efforts, partisan activity remained a constant drain on resources, contributing to the war's attritional nature. Civilian populations under Finnish occupation were also a source of tension and adaptation. In East Karelia, Finnish authorities attempted to implement a policy that distinguished between Finno-Ugric populations, such as Karelians and Vepsians, who were regarded as culturally linked to Finland, and ethnic Russians, who were considered politically unreliable. While Karelians were encouraged to cooperate, Russians were often confined in camps or subjected to forced labor. By 1942, around 20,000 civilians were held in such camps, where shortages of food and medicine caused high mortality. These policies hardened local resistance, fueling partisan recruitment, and ensuring that the occupation remained unstable. For Finland's civilian population, the war demanded constant adaptation. Mobilization had drawn nearly 500,000 men into uniform, leaving agriculture and industry short of labor. Women, youths, and older men filled the gaps, while rationing was introduced to manage scarce resources. Food shortages became acute by 1942, as imports dwindled and poor harvests limited supplies. Urban populations relied on ration cards that provided only minimal sustenance, while rural communities struggled with requisition demands. Yet despite these hardships, morale held, strengthened by the belief that Finland was defending its survival and by the symbolic return of Karelia. Innovation in resource management was essential. Finland expanded its domestic production of weapons and munitions, often improvising with limited materials. Small arms and artillery were repaired and reused, while local industries manufactured substitutes for scarce imports. Fuel shortages prompted experiments with wood gas generators for vehicles, and clothing industries adapted to produce winter gear from domestic wool. These measures allowed Finland to sustain the war effort despite limited external support, though dependence on German deliveries of grain, oil, and military equipment remained unavoidable. Psychological strain weighed heavily on soldiers and civilians alike. By 1942, Finnish soldiers had been at the front for over a year, enduring harsh winters and monotonous trench warfare. Casualties mounted not only from combat, but also from frostbite, disease, and accidents. Letters from the front reveal both determination and fatigue. Determination to hold the line against the Soviet Union, fatigue from the endless routine of patrols, fortification work, and partisan skirmishes. Civilians shared this burden, facing rationing, air raid alarms, and the uncertainty of an extended conflict. On the political front, Finland continued its careful balancing act. Leaders in Helsinki emphasized that the country's war aims were defensive and distinct from Germany's ideological crusade. Propaganda avoided references to Nazi ideology, framing the war instead as a national struggle for survival and the correction of the injustices of the 1940 peace treaty. Yet, diplomatic isolation deepened. Britain had declared war on Finland in December 1941, and the United States, while not formally at war, increasingly viewed Finland as aligned with the Axis. Germany remained the only major partner, reinforcing Finland's dependence. The Soviet Union, recognizing Finland's limited aims but unwilling to accept its territorial gains, launched propaganda and diplomatic efforts aimed at dividing Finland from Germany. Moscow broadcast appeals to Finnish soldiers, emphasizing common roots among Karelians and Finns, while at the same time conducting air raids on Finnish cities to weaken morale. In military terms, Soviet forces strengthened their positions opposite Finnish lines, preparing for future offensives but conserving resources for more critical battles at Stalingrad and the Southern Front in 1942. By the close of 1942, the phase of resistance and adaptation had defined Finland's war. The front had stabilized, but partisan warfare and economic shortages imposed constant strain. The Finnish army proved capable of holding extended lines despite its limited resources, while society adapted through rationing, improvisation, and sheer endurance. Yet Finland's reliance on Germany was growing deeper, and the Soviet Union's recovery signaled that renewed offensives were only a matter of time. The war had shifted from one of rapid advances to a test of resilience, leaving Finland caught in a prolonged struggle that demanded both patience and sacrifice. The turning point for Finland in the Second World War came gradually during 1943, when the wider trajectory of the conflict shifted decisively against Germany. Until then, Finland had managed to sustain its defensive positions, presenting the war as a continuation of the Winter War rather than a full alliance with Nazi Germany. But as the Red Army began to recover from its losses and mount increasingly powerful offensives, Finland's strategic position became precarious. The balance of power was tilting, and the choices made in 1943-1944 would determine whether Finland could preserve its independence or share the fate of the occupied Baltic states. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked the beginning of this turning point. Until then, Finnish leaders had cautiously believed that Germany might still compel the Soviet Union into submission, securing Finland's territorial gains. After Stalingrad, however, it became clear that the Soviet Union was regaining the initiative. Reports from Finnish military intelligence, which closely monitored German movements, indicated that Berlin was shifting forces south to stem the Soviet advance, leaving fewer resources available for the Northern Front. This meant that Finnish lines, though stable, would increasingly have to be held without significant German reinforcement. On the battlefield, the front in Karelia remained largely static throughout 1943. Finnish forces dug into entrenched positions on the Karelian Isthmus and along the river Svir. The Red Army conducted probing attacks and artillery bombardments, but refrained from large-scale assaults while it concentrated its strength for campaigns further south. This lull gave the Finnish army time to improve fortifications, but it also heightened anxiety. Soldiers understood that once Soviet offensives reached the Leningrad region in force, the Finnish sector would inevitably become a target. Meanwhile, partisan warfare intensified. Soviet partisans launched increasingly coordinated raids against Finnish rear areas, striking supply depots, railways, and isolated garrisons. In July 1943, a major partisan raid destroyed several villages in East Karelia, killing civilians and seizing supplies before retreating into the forests. Such actions forced Finland to divert more troops to anti-partisan duties, weakening the front-line's strength. Civilian casualties rose, and morale in occupied areas declined as the population faced both partisan attacks and Finnish countermeasures. Diplomatic maneuvering became critical as the war turned. President Risto Ryti and Foreign Minister Rolf Witting sought contacts with neutral countries, hoping to explore options for a separate peace with the Soviet Union. Sweden, officially neutral but sympathetic to Finland, served as an intermediary. Initial approaches in 1943 revealed Moscow's hard line. Any peace would require Finland to abandon its territorial gains and possibly accept harsher conditions than in 1940. For Finnish leaders, who feared Soviet occupation and annexation, these terms were unacceptable. Still, the fact that negotiations were attempted reflected growing awareness that the war could not be sustained indefinitely. At the same time, Finland's dependence on Germany deepened. As supplies of food and fuel dwindled, Berlin provided essential shipments of grain, oil, and military equipment. In exchange, Germany demanded continued Finnish commitment to the war effort. In September 1943, Heinrich Himmler visited Helsinki, pressuring Finland to stand firm alongside Germany. Marshal Mannerheim, aware of Germany's weakening position but unwilling to provoke Berlin, assured continued cooperation while privately maintaining doubts about Germany's ability to win. This balancing act defined Finland's diplomacy throughout 1943-1944, outward loyalty to Germany, but discreet efforts to explore an exit strategy. On the home front, the turning point was visible in the growing strain on society. Rationing intensified as Allied control of sea routes limited Finland's imports. The winter of 1942-1943 was marked by severe shortages of bread and fuel, with urban populations particularly affected. Agricultural output declined as manpower shortages worsened, yet morale remained relatively resilient, reinforced by the belief that Finland was still defending its existence. Government propaganda avoided triumphalism, instead stressing endurance, unity, and vigilance against Soviet aggression. The psychological burden on the army also increased. Soldiers in the trenches experienced long months of inactivity, interrupted by sudden artillery barrages or partisan raids. Fatigue and war weariness became common, though discipline held. Many soldiers, reflecting on the course of the wider war, began to doubt whether Finland's objectives were achievable. At the same time, reports of German setbacks in the south and increasing Allied air raids across Europe reached the front, reinforcing the sense that Germany's fortunes were in irreversible decline. By early 1944, the turning point was undeniable. The Red Army had lifted the siege of Leningrad in January, breaking through German lines and pushing westward. This altered the balance directly in Finland's sector, as Soviet forces now had greater freedom to concentrate against the Finnish army. Intelligence reports warned of massive troop buildups opposite the Karelian Isthmus, suggesting that a major offensive was imminent. For Finland, this meant the war would soon return to full-scale intensity, and the survival of the nation was once again at stake. Thus, the turning point for Finland was not a single battle, but a gradual shift between 1943 and early 1944. The German collapse at Stalingrad, the Soviet resurgence, and the increasing isolation of Finland diplomatically all converged to create a new reality. What had once seemed like a chance to recover lost lands and secure defensible borders now threatened to become a struggle for national existence. The stage was set for the decisive Soviet offensives of 1944, which would test whether Finland could adapt once more and survive between the two great powers pressing on its borders. By the summer of 1944, the long-anticipated Soviet offensive against Finland materialized in full force, marking the most dangerous phase of the continuation war and bringing Finland to the brink of collapse. The Red Army, freed from the siege of Leningrad and victorious in southern campaigns, redeployed massive forces to the Karelian Isthmus. Opposite Finnish positions, the Soviets concentrated around 450,000 men, supported by over 600 tanks, 600 aircraft, and extensive artillery. Facing them, Finland deployed about 250,000 soldiers, with far fewer tanks and only around 200 aircraft. The disparity in strength underscored the gravity of the situation. On 9 June 1944, the Soviet offensive began with an immense artillery barrage, one of the heaviest Finland had ever experienced. For hours, shells rained down on Finnish positions along the isthmus, shattering bunkers and communications. This was followed by infantry and armored assaults that overwhelmed the forward defenses. Within days, Soviet troops penetrated deep into Finnish lines, capturing Vyborg, Viipuri, on 20 June. The loss of Vyborg, the symbolically important city recovered in 1941, dealt a severe blow to Finnish morale and underscored the scale of the Soviet advance. Retreats were chaotic in many sectors, though Finnish units fought delaying actions wherever possible. Soviet armored spearheads attempted rapid exploitation, seeking to break through to the heart of Finland and force unconditional surrender. Civilians fled westward in large numbers as towns and villages along the isthmus were overrun. By late June, the Red Army had advanced up to 100 kilometers, and the Finnish command faced the real possibility of national collapse. The crisis forced Finland to mobilize all available resources. Reserves were rushed to the front, and the government appealed directly to Germany for aid. Adolf Hitler, recognizing Finland's importance as an ally in the Northern Theater, agreed to provide assistance under the so-called Ryti-Ribbentrop Agreement. In exchange for President Risto Riti's personal guarantee that Finland would not make a separate peace with the Soviet Union while he remained in office, Germany delivered vital arms, including 15,000 Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, modern artillery, and additional aircraft. These supplies proved crucial in restoring Finnish defensive capacity. The decisive moment came in early July at the Battle of Tali-Ihantala, fought between 25 June and 9 July 1944. This engagement, involving about 50,000 Finnish soldiers against roughly 100,000 Soviets, became the largest battle in Nordic history. Finnish forces, heavily outnumbered but reinforced with German anti-tank weapons and supported by concentrated artillery fire, managed to halt the Soviet advance. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and the limited Finnish Air Force was highly effective. Finnish gunners fired over 120,000 shells in carefully directed barrages, breaking up Soviet armored attacks. By mid-July, the Red Army's momentum on the isthmus had been checked and the front stabilized. Simultaneously, battles raged on the Svir and in East Karelia. There, too, Soviet offensives forced Finnish withdrawals, and by August, Finnish forces had abandoned most of the territories occupied since 1941. The strategic aim of expanding into East Karelia was now fully reversed. However, unlike on the isthmus, the withdrawals in Karelia were more orderly, with Finnish units maintaining cohesion and avoiding encirclement. By September, The front had contracted to roughly the 1940 borders, with Finland fighting defensively to preserve independence rather than to hold conquests. The consequences for civilians were severe. More than 250,000 people were evacuated from Karelia as Finnish forces retreated, many of them for the second time since 1940. Infrastructure was destroyed in scorched earth withdrawals to deny resources to the advancing Soviets. In East Karelia, civilians who had lived under Finnish occupation since 1941 now faced deportation or retribution by Soviet authorities. Refugee flows strained Finland's already limited resources, adding to the sense of national emergency. Diplomatic repercussions also intensified. The Soviet Union demanded unconditional surrender, but Finland's survival after Tali-Ihantala gave its leaders leverage to negotiate. Behind the scenes, Marshal Mannerheim, who replaced Ryti as president in August 1944, opened new contacts with Moscow through intermediaries in Stockholm. These efforts aimed to secure an armistice without complete occupation, even as Finnish troops still faced Soviet pressure on the battlefield. By the end of summer 1944, Finland had survived the worst crisis of the continuation war. The Soviet offensives had recaptured Karelia and inflicted heavy losses. Finnish casualties in the summer battles exceeded 60,000, while Soviet casualties were estimated at over 150,000, including thousands of tanks and aircraft destroyed or disabled. Despite the disparity in numbers, Finland had avoided collapse, thanks to desperate mobilization, German aid, and the resilience of its troops. This phase marked the true turning point of Finland's wartime experience. What began in 1941 as a campaign of territorial recovery and expansion had by 1944 narrowed to a struggle for survival. The stabilization of the front after Tali-Ihantala created the conditions for negotiation, but it also underscored Finland's precarious position. Between Germany's declining power and the Soviet Union's demands, Finland now had to prepare for the difficult process of securing peace without losing its independence. The aftermath of the summer battles of 1944 forced Finland into a process of urgent negotiation and withdrawal. The stabilization of the front at Tali-Ihantala and on the Karelian Isthmus created the breathing space necessary for political maneuvering, but the costs of continued fighting were unsustainable. Finnish casualties in June-August had exceeded 60,000, while material losses and evacuations placed immense strain on the population. The Soviet Union, though checked tactically, still held overwhelming superiority in manpower and equipment. Germany, Finland's sole supplier of critical weapons and grain, was itself in retreat on every front. The conclusion was unavoidable. Finland could not continue the war. Marshal Mannerheim's appointment as president in early August 1944 marked the beginning of the peace process. Unlike his predecessor Ryti, who had tied Finland to Germany through personal commitments, Mannerheim maintained a reputation as a soldier statesman and a cautious pragmatist. His first task was to assure Berlin that Finland remained loyal, while secretly pursuing channels to Moscow through Sweden. These contacts culminated in an armistice signed on 19th September 1944 between Finland and the Soviet Union, with Britain acting as co-signatory. The terms of the armistice were harsh but not fatal to Finnish independence. Finland agreed to restore the borders of the Moscow Peace Treaty of 1940, ceding Karelia, Salla, and Petsamo to the Soviet Union. In addition, Finland had to lease the Porkala Peninsula near Helsinki to Moscow for use as a naval base. Reparations of $300 million to be paid in goods over 6 years were imposed, requiring deliveries of timber, ships, and machinery. Most significantly, Finland was required to expel German troops from its territory, an obligation that triggered the Lapland War between September 1944 and April 1945. The German presence in northern Finland numbered around 200,000 men under General Lothar Rendulic. Initially, the withdrawal proceeded in stages, with German forces retreating toward Norway. However, as relations deteriorated, fighting broke out. The Lapland War was a brutal campaign fought under Arctic conditions, involving scorched earth tactics as the Germans destroyed infrastructure during their retreat. Towns such as Rovaniemi were burned, railways torn up, and bridges demolished. By the spring of 1945, northern Finland lay devastated, but German troops had been driven out. The humanitarian consequences of the aftermath were immense. Over 400,000 evacuees from Karelia had to be resettled, many for the second time since 1940. Housing, farmland, and jobs had to be found for them in a country already impoverished by war. The destruction in Lapland added further burdens, with tens of thousands left homeless amid ruined towns. Despite these hardships, Finland avoided the fate of occupied Eastern Europe. It retained its sovereignty, parliamentary system, and armed forces, albeit under strict limitations. Politically, the armistice reshaped the Finnish state. The Communist Party, banned since 1930, was legalized, and left-wing figures entered government. A war responsibility trial in 1945 convicted several former leaders, including Risto Raiti, who was sentenced to imprisonment. The presence of the Allied Control Commission, dominated by the Soviets, ensured compliance with the terms. Yet Finland preserved its institutions and avoided a communist takeover, a unique outcome in Eastern Europe at the end of the war. Internationally, Finland's position remained ambiguous. Western powers recognized its independence, but regarded it as within the Soviet sphere of influence, formalized later by the Paris Peace Treaty of 1947. Reparations bound Finland's economy to Soviet trade, yet they also spurred rapid industrialization as Finland expanded its shipbuilding and metal industries to meet quotas. Over time, this economic adaptation contributed to Finland's post-war modernization. In military terms, Finland emerged weakened but intact. The army was reduced in size, and heavy weapons were limited under the treaty, but unlike the Baltic states, Finland kept control over its national defense. This preserved a measure of deterrence and became a cornerstone of its Cold War policy of armed neutrality. The wartime experience had demonstrated both the vulnerabilities and the resilience of the Finnish state, lessons that shaped its defense doctrine for decades. The legacy of the Winter War and the Continuation War echoed long after 1945. For many Finns, the wars were remembered as a defensive struggle to preserve independence, even though the alignment with Germany remained controversial. Public memory emphasized sacrifice, unity, and survival, while political debates continued over the extent to which Finland had acted independently versus serving German aims. Historians later described Finland's wartime policy as a delicate balance where the overriding goal was national survival in impossible circumstances. Commemoration took multiple forms. Veterans organizations preserved the memory of those who fought on the front lines, while monuments honored the fallen in both the Winter War and the Continuation War. The evacuation and resettlement of Karelians became a central theme of national identity, symbolizing both loss and endurance. Diplomatic memory also shaped Finland's foreign policy. Never again could the country rely on external powers for salvation, and thus neutrality, careful diplomacy, and self-defense became enduring principles. In the broader history of the Second World War, Finland's path stands out as exceptional. Unlike its Baltic neighbors, Finland resisted incorporation into the Soviet Union. Unlike other German co-belligerents, it managed to exit the war with its sovereignty intact. The cost was immense. 95,000 Finnish soldiers killed, 200,000 wounded, hundreds of thousands displaced, and entire regions lost permanently. The Soviet Union also paid heavily on the Finnish front, with estimates of over 200,000 dead across the Winter and Continuation Wars. Yet Finland's survival as an independent democracy in the shadow of two great powers was an outcome few would have predicted in 1939. Thus, the echoes of the Winter War and the Continuation War were not only military, but also political and cultural. Finland's survival between Germany and the USSR became a symbol of strategic adaptation and resilience. The wars left behind scars, both territorial and human, but also forged a durable national identity, cautious, pragmatic, and determined to maintain independence at all costs. In the end, Finland's ability to navigate between great powers without losing its sovereignty ensured its unique place in the wartime and post-war history of Europe.